That was amazing. Thanks, Dan. So before we open up the discussion to all speakers, there are a couple of quite specific questions that I think people had for you.
Sure.
Who was our first? Karen, you wanted to ask something about cheetah footprints. Is that right? Karen?
Oh, I see such great questions here.
Yes, hi. No, just in general. So I'm working with Zoe's dual conservation footprint identification technique, where we have take footprint photos, photos of footprints to identify. I was just wondering if there was a similar species classification for footprints, sort of a general database or you know.
It's a great question. I'm going to use this as a launching point to do another little bit of kind of AI for Earth branding. So she referred to Conservation Fit, an organization that uses computer vision to recognize both species and individuals from footprints of animals, which I think is really exciting work. I know Zoe well. That's a great example of what we'd like to do. We can't do every one of these machine learning problems, but what we really want to do, the Conservation Fit is a perfect example of the kind of organization we'd like to help get the work, the great work that you've already done up onto the cloud and exposed as an API and a web service. And we work really closely with organizations to try to make that as seamless as possible and help people who haven't built web services before. So rather than trying to solve every machine learning problem ourselves, of course, advise and try to be helpful and give machine learning advice, but also really help organizations already doing work like that get live on the cloud. So I think Conservation Fit is a great example of the kind of organization we'd like to work with in that department.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thomas, Tom, do you want to jump in and ask a question about Microsoft and Wildlife Insights?
Sure, thanks, Steph. So my question, Dan, was just about the Microsoft image repository and how it relates to, or how it differs from Wildlife Insights and Team and all of these other repositories.
An excellent question. I will say the goal of Lila.science is very different than, so Wildlife Insights is much more than a data repository. Or Wildlife Insights aims to be a place that biologists manage their images, where machine learning runs on their images, and a data repository. So it is they have some very rich goals, and I think by all signs they'll get there soon. What we've built is something I think much simpler, which is a place to take archival, well-curated, labeled data and host those data sets and make them available to machine learning folks who want to work with data like this. So what Lila.science is not going to grow into is a place where biologists, there's no upload button. There's no upload one image. There's no manage my images. It is a set of curated archival data sets for people to work with to help move the machine learning side of things forward. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thanks, Dan. I think, was Dave going to jump on in this one as well?
Yeah.
Was that about right, Dave? I think they hit different ends of the complete spectrum, and they're both really important and play nicely together.
Yeah, that's definitely right. And I wanted to add one interesting thing. This is reflects to another question that was asked earlier a little bit. The one thing that's really interesting to me is how these different machine learning models can interact. You know, the one that's working on Wildlife Insights is camera trap focused, but if you look at iNaturalist photos, they're slightly different. And one thing that's one kind of problem for me that's interesting is how do we connect these different sort of minds, right? Like, let's say the Wildlife Insights model can't figure something out. It's not very confident. Can it then send it to the iNaturalist model, you know, and then can iNaturalist then send that off to a citizen scientist? And how can the iNaturalist tell us what images it's willing to send to its citizen scientists, because it doesn't want to barrage them with, you know, images of deer, right? So there's this whole kind of interesting ecosystem around these different models and how they can interact with each other in useful ways that I think is place that's ripe for a line of investigation.
Or even within camera traps, or even within East African camera trap models, there's going to be, if we all succeed in getting data out there, there's going to be 15 different East African camera trap models that are all great in different ways. And yes, an ecosystem is definitely necessary to help all of those play nicely. And I don't think that's 10 years away. That's in 2 years, there'll be 15 great open source models that classify camera trap images from East Africa, and getting them all to play nicely together is an exciting ecosystem challenge.
Right, it gets to data sharing and standards around, you know, data discovery. It's great space.
Sorry, I was muted. Sarah, do you want to jump in here as well, and we'll open this discussion up, because this is the big question that seems to be key. Like, as a person who is aware of machine learning and quite aware of all of the different players in the space, but still kind of an outsider because it's not my day-to-day thing. How do you all work together, and what is needed to, like, for conservationists who are not like eyeball deep in like machine learning and all of the management tools that are out there? How do you choose what to use, and how do they talk to each other, and what's needed to create, to collaborate and make sure, like, I think the worry from the conservationist side is if you go down, if you choose to go down one route, you get stuck in it with one technology, or Microsoft or Google or Amazon, or whichever one you choose to go down. That's a very broad question, but how are things collaborating, and how do you choose who to partner with, or do you need to choose?
I'll take one first stab at that, which is that the volumes of data we're talking about in the grand scheme of data that moves around corporate clouds every day is not so big in camera traps, for example, in particular, that the idea of a multi-cloud world here, people shouldn't get too worried about whether if your data lives on AWS and there's a great Google or Microsoft API that you want to use to classify your images. There are no major infrastructural roadblocks. I know it sounds daunting, but people make calls from local to the cloud and across giant corporate clouds every day with data volumes that would blow our minds. And so I certainly don't think there is once you choose a path for part of your ecosystem, you are now stuck forever on that cloud. I think I'm dodging the question though, because the harder problem is then, okay, well, how do I have my data wherever it is, and there's models everywhere. How do I figure out how to actually run those different models on my data and decide which one's working best? And honestly, I don't have a clear answer to that question. I think this WildLabs community probably has as good a shot as anybody figuring out the right way to bring those things together.
Jez, do you want to just jump in, because we're having a private chat? I think you've got something to comment here, and it relates to the API stuff you've been talking to me about, right?
Sure. Yeah, I was curious with all the different models out there, with a approach like the Metascore that's being discussed in the chat group. Does that cause a multiplication of the compute cycles and therefore cost of running all of these models, and what's the overall efficiency of that?
I don't have.
Yeah, actually, I haven't heard of the Metascore model factory, model warehouse thing. I think that's pretty cool. But going back to what Dan was saying, the conservation data is relatively small compared to lots of other data that's being tossed around. One of the things when I was at Google, one of the things we always talked about was YouTube data, and people always said, well, how is Google using justifying using its resources for Earth observation data? And the answer was always like, if you compare it to YouTube and how much traffic YouTube is, it's just like not even noticeable. So I'm not sure from a world health perspective if we should worry too much about inefficiencies of trying out multiple models. when it comes to actual like costs for conservation organizations to do it, then it becomes another question. But in terms of just general efficiency of electricity in the world, I don't know it's something that we should be too worried about.
I think the places where we need to worry about it a little, I completely agree. I don't think that in terms of the kinds of, loosely we're alluding to a vision where models are running on camera trap images more and more. I agree. Those are not going to be amounts of compute that scare anybody. I think I want to draw an interesting line for people who are on this call. Some people probably also work with climate and atmospheric data, where now I think, yeah, you can worry about that, like, because that now we're at a different order of magnitude of data volume. And if you are running, 4 competing models on large on daily satellite data from the entire world, now that's compute you have to worry about. A lot of the conservation type data, the either movement or camera trap image data, is a lot smaller. On the flip side, there's a lot of scenarios where people are still going to need to run models locally where connectivity is poor. And that's a case where now we do need to start thinking about, well, I can't really just run my 10 favorite models on a laptop in the field. The middle space that we've loosely been alluding to, which is kind of medium-sized data in the cloud, I think we have a lot of leeway. We can't run 1 million models on every image, but it wouldn't worry me to run 5 to 10 models on every image.
Can I ask Kate, do you want to jump in and ask a question about screening and how to choose people to work with?
Yes, thanks everyone for the really good talks today. I was thinking about, since some of you are working basically at vendors, if you have advice for people who are coming to this work with limited resources for what types of questions and frameworks we should be using when we are trying to put together a stack that takes all of our field data from multiple sources, structured and unstructured, and pulls it together into a synthetic analytic product. Because as you've said, it's not so much where you put it in the cloud or where it lives, but if I need to put together a package of different services, an API that can identify my images, a source of temperature data, all of these things, it's helpful for me to sort of have a list or a set of ideas for what's a good set of specs, so that when somebody's trying to sell me a product or I'm trying to figure out where to spend my money, I know what to prioritize. Have you seen good examples of that, or do you have recommendations?
And I'll just underscore, this was the second most popular question that came through in our registration sign-up form. How do people with limited resources, how do organizations with limited resources make the most of, how do they engage with big data effectively?
I would say maybe one first step is to really think carefully about your domain, like define your domain and where you see it might end up, so that you make sure that the resources you choose are like the best possible that fit that full domain. Because I can definitely, like, the choices are definitely overwhelming, and of course there's not time to even necessarily get an overview of all of them, but having your data in a state where they can be applied, and then knowing what it is you think you're going to want in the end, because I guess the worst case scenario is you invest time getting it into one place, and then you find out, oh, actually the scope of that doesn't get to where I need to be. And I would say, like, when you're, it might seem obvious at first, but if you think about where do you want to be in 5 years or 10 years, you might be able to avoid yourself some future problems by kind of thinking that out a bit.
I want just to jump in here, another question that came from Alexandra, I'm not sure if you're on the line, was, and I think it ties in here because it was a question about finding mentors and people to guide you through this space. Do you think there's a role for mentorship, and like, is that something that that we as a conservation community should be? Oh, you are in line. Hi, Alexandra. Do you want to jump in and ask this question and give it some context?
Hi, sure. Hi. Okay, so the question, that is because I believe I'm one of the least experienced in technologies for wildlife, comes exactly from this area where we have initiatives, we see the potential, but we lack the people to be able to ask for advice. So this is why, I don't know if that makes a better sense. But the question is, how do we get a network that we can ask, a network of support, let's say, that we can ask for help when we are not necessarily technology-driven persons in conservation. And the other one would be, how do we get technology for conservation initiatives that are independent from the nonprofit to actually take, well, I come from WWF Romania, so I don't know if, I think that only fits Romania, to take WWF in consideration when developing new technologies for the environment and for conservation, because we don't necessarily have technology departments, or let's say like that.
I'll give a partial answer to the question about how to get up and running and get started in this area if you're a conservation biologist. Let's say you're a technically inclined conservation biologist with limited experience in machine learning. The one thing I'll say is that all of the big cloud companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, all really want you to be able to do this kind of work on the cloud. And so it's interesting, all three companies that I just said have different forms of giving away cloud compute and education to help people get started, but all of them take this really seriously and have different forms of grant programs to give you cloud credits and help you figure out how to use them. None of these companies are there to just toss cloud credits over the fence and say good luck. The AI for Earth and Google Earth Outreach, for example, spend a lot of time working with conservation organizations to help them make meaningful use of the cloud and provide pretty hands-on education to help people get started in this space. So I would say that is a really good first line of approach, is check out what at least all three of those companies are doing to help people get started with machine learning in the cloud. Because I know it's intimidating if it's a new space for you, but we all really want you to be able to do this in the cloud. It's good for everybody. It's good for business. It's good for the world. We all really want to help you do this. So those are great starting points, I think.
Thank you, but the idea is that we are actually trying to tap into this environment and have some projects, but we constantly, so instead of being like a free-flowing effort, well, we constantly have blockages where we believe would need some advice. That's why the question of having like a mentorship community where we can ask and get some advice.
So I'm going to jump in here because that's what you're talking about is a community of practice, and where you can ask questions and find support, and which is exactly what WildLabs was created with WWF as one of our core partners among a slew of others. So it was created to have a space online where you can, as a field user of conservation tech, you can access other people who are looking at machine learning and looking at deploying the technologies you're investigating, can ask questions and find answers and have that sort of mentorship direct. You can connect directly with other members. We've got over 3,000 members worldwide. So I think, and this is part of why we've created this virtual meetup series, so that we can bring people together and have them talk to each other in the chat and talk with the experts like Dan, Sarah, and Thau. So I think, if there's interest in having more formal mentoring and having that that one-to-one sort of advice, it's something we could totally explore and help facilitate if it's a need that you have if that's what the blockage is, then it's really something that we were created by the conservation community for the conservation community. Yeah. Oh, I was just mentoring would be fantastic. Yeah, it's been something I've been kind of wondering about whether it would be something worth exploring. And like there are heaps of questions that came in, like, how do I get involved in, how can my skills be applied towards wildlife conservation? How can I, as a student, what should I be learning? As a tech person or a beginner, like what open source projects are available. So there's a lot of desire, I think, from people to get that sort of support. Yes, oh my goodness, John, I've also been thinking about office hours as well. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting a bit excited. So yes, but as you're a WWF person, I think this throws back to a question, could we throw this back to Thau, because there was a question way back that was, who spoke I imagine Thau's, as with your new role in WWF, support to partners would be in your remit potentially, but there was a long question. Okay, Stefan wanted me to ask, since you recently transitioned from Google to WWF, can you talk about what kind of impact you can have now in a conservation NGO that you couldn't have in a tech company? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the context being Google and Microsoft are both applying their machine learning algorithms to conservation problems. So as a software engineer, data scientist could work for either of these in the IT sector or in the NGO sector. Is WWF trying to attract machine learning practitioners? Can NGOs compete with tech companies on attracting talent? And do they need to?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Yeah, and just touching on the mentorship one, I think one next step would be to reach out to like Google and Microsoft and see about like hosting office hours or something like that. I think both those, and also like Esri and Amazon, like I think all those people would be really interested in that.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Okay, I'm on it. It's on my list.
Yeah, and then yeah, so the reason I switched over to conservation organization was, first, I love conservation and it's what I was doing before Google, and I wanted to focus more entirely on it. But another reason was that at Google and Microsoft and these other places, the people there are tool builders, and they're fantastic tool builders. But there's a gap between when you build a tool and how it's used. And so what we were doing was relying on NGOs and other organizations to use our tools to have impact, but we were one step away. And it's not clear to me, and I think that we need to do a lot more around bridging the gap between data and decisions. And at Google, you know, and this is true at Microsoft and Amazon, we're really good at building tools to help analyze data and present data, but the step from getting from data to actually having impact is not in our hands at the technology companies. It's in the hands of decision makers out in the world. It's in the hands of NGOs who help drive those decisions. And so that's the place where I see the conservation organizations really playing a role in impact. It's actually helping drive the impact. I don't think that the conservation organizations are competing with the technologists to build tools. I think the role is to figure out how to take the tools and have them make impact and actually be on the ground with the people who are having that impact and driving those decisions to see how best to use those tools and to feed that information back to the tool makers.
Aurelie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's one of those things that still challenges me on a daily basis. It's like, yeah, we make maps, we make things, and then don't really know what the decision maker wants. You have to hold their hand while they put the mouse over the map, or is it, you know, do you just have to take a decision for them, or do you have to teach them how to use these tools? I still feel like we make a lot of great analyses, but they still, you're right, or maybe the decision makers don't want to be influenced. I don't know, but any clever way to influence decision makers, you know, with these analyses and maps and things, I think, you know, we're all ears.
Can I throw out one thing that maybe ties a couple of different threads going here together, which is especially people who maybe don't feel like they're savvy enough with technology or feel like they're not sure where to start, really don't be afraid to find the contact people for any of these projects, and don't feel like you just have to be on the internet. Like, we're having a virtual meetup right now, right? So we can't just go chat and like I can stop in your office while I'm getting my coffee and talk to you about something that came up. But I mean, it's definitely worth your time, especially if you find something you're really interested in. Send the email, see if you can call them. If there's a phone number, try calling somebody or set up a time to have a virtual meeting. Because I think both you might be able to get a massive amount of training and knowledge and ideas from just having some chat time with people. And also those people might find your particular use case or your particular questions extremely valuable, because we're not all in the same office together. So it might be very informative for me to hear from somebody, like I mentioned in the presentation. If someone comes to me and says, here's what I want to do for my conservation work, I'm doing this and this, but what do you think I should, that can be really valuable time. And it's, I think, something we don't do enough, because especially with tech stuff where we're doing a lot of stuff over the internet and not face-to-face as often, I think there's a lot of kind of just connections we can build just by like, can I have 20 minutes of your time on the phone? Could be really valuable. And I think we don't do it very often, a lot of us.
Snaps to that, Sarah. That's totally been my experience. And I will also flag that as the community manager of Wild Labs, you can always email me if you want to be connected with people, or if you have questions, because we have such a great, within our community, but also it's part of my job to go and bring people in. So I'm happy to connect people as well. But oh my goodness, I'm shameless about contacting people for coffee, especially off Twitter. It's I have a standing invite in my calendar for Fridays to talk to people, and people are so generous with their time. So yeah, I would really encourage that. Okay, there's two more questions that have come through. Oh, actually a couple. Yeah, so there's a big discussion that's happening around, okay, how do I wrap this up? There's a gap between tool builders, NGO, and policymakers, and we need to build bridges. There's also, okay, there's a discussion happening. Rob, you had a question about being a Debbie Downer, and you also had some specific questions earlier in the talk. Did you want to jump in and have at it? Because you're up at 3 a.m. and I feel like we should probably give you a chance to talk.
Damn right. Damn right I should be able to talk. I'm very tired. No, thank you everyone. It's been really fascinating. This is probably an emerging area for a lot of conservation biologists. This sort of big data, AI, machine learning stuff is just sort of, we're still getting used to GPS collars, most of us, I think. My thoughts are, though, it's amazing to see, watching Dave's presentation to start with, and then how far machine learning is coming, and Sarah's work with MoveBank and all that stuff. I'm seeing all this amazing data sort of being compiled, and all these amazing sort of tools to be able to crunch data. Why, and I asked in my question, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer because this is such a great, uplifting conversation, but why are we failing so prevalently in so many areas of conservation if we do have access to all this great information? Thank you.
Okay, I can take a stab at that. All right, so one Pollyanna answer to that is it could be worse. Maybe we're not succeeding in turning things around. The Living Planet report came out recently talking about the 60% decline in populations. That's not so good. With all the protected areas that we have, we probably are making a positive impact, right? It's not positive enough. And I think a lot of it comes down to this gap between data and decisions. If I think about Global Forest Watch and the monitoring that happens there, we're good at putting red dots on the map and having alerts, but getting that information into the hands of people who want to do something about it and who can do something about it in a form that they understand is something that we're not doing enough. And I think this is we need to be focusing more on it. And this is not about GIS analysis or data analysis. This is about, a lot of it is about behavioral analysis. A lot of it is about storytelling. How do we get information? How do we translate the information that we're all generating into a form that can have that can help the policymakers and the people in charge of governance and markets give them the information that they need to make their policies.
Paul, did you want to jump in? You've been commenting, Paul Milhauser.
Well, yeah, just briefly, I've done some work with folks who are working on novel ways of visualizing big data. And I mean, that's a problem not just in conservation, but in a lot of fields increasingly. I think that really is the big problem, as you were alluding to just now. We have a lot of data. We've really made some progress on how we as scientists cope with it, but we haven't done a very good job of taking the data and communicating effectively to different audiences, whether it's the public or decision makers. And I think that's maybe an equally big, if not bigger, challenge.
So actually, one of the, I've been talking to one of our other community members about the meetups next year, and he was really, his work is, he works with Internet of Elephants, if anyone's heard about them, which is focused on taking data and turning it into games, taking like live animal tracking data or movement data and turning it into games for kids and using augmented reality and really interesting ways of storytelling with data, really. And we were kind of thinking that Meetup for next year should be around storytelling, and it sounds like it's almost a natural progression of this. Like one, Thau, you talked about in your opening slide us needing to move from just getting the data to being able to like just monitoring to be able to responding. And I think the responding happens in two areas. One's like responding on the ground, but also it's what we do with that data and that next step and that storytelling and how we affect decision making. Yeah, we were talking about having Nat Geo Jazz as one of potentially having them talk about how they use it because it's so effective. Yeah, how do we take data and drive impact? So yes, I'm just putting it out there. That could be a discussion forum that we pick up in the new year.
So I think the storytelling is really awesome, and then to think about, and it's like to build our stories and practice them, and then be able to modify them based on who we're talking to and what they care about, and don't assume they all care about animals, especially they don't. And so think about how can we change the story? How can we connect with people with different priorities, and then building. And I think depending on where people are working, you may already have a dialogue with decision makers in your area if you're working for a small NGO, but you might not. And think about how you want them to come to you when the logging company comes and tells them XYZ. You want them to say, hey, does this sound right to you? And so how can you be, don't just engage with other people who care about conservation, figure out how you can have those you can build some trust with the people making decisions and have an ongoing dialogue. And I think a lot of NGOs are probably doing that at different levels, but think where you can build that in so that they're coming to you when they're trying to make a decision.
Just to follow that, Sarah, do you have experience? I'm not familiar enough with, like, I know what MoveBake is, but that next step, and I guess Wildlife Insights would be another question, another example. Do you have examples of how MoveBake is facilitating that decision making, impacting decision makers and being used to tell stories?
Well, one thing that's come up a bunch of times where I've been involved in helping people kind of get the information they need is with like wind energy development, and a map showing here's where these animals went can be extremely powerful. And you could show, I mean, the birds are very good at figuring out exactly where you should put wind turbines, right? You could use them to predict where to put wind turbines. So just really basic maps of where tracked animals went has come. I've had a lot of people, I can think of several instances where that has been something where they've been able to pretty easily communicate and get that input into wind energy development decisions.
Because it's quite interesting. It's not like, it seems like your point is that it actually, and this comes up again and again with conservation tech, it's not about the shiniest, the most beautiful, the most high-tech augmented reality like displays of information, but it's really, sometimes it can be as simple as just a map and finding, was that an agreement or a question? A disagreement?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh.
You're on my screen.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, yeah, either way, I mean, I wouldn't assume you have to have something amazing. I mean, in those cases, again, I mean, there might be some decision makers who a fancy animation is going to go way farther, but not necessarily.
Mm-hmm. So I'm conscious that we've got 5 minutes left. I wonder if each of the speakers would like to comment on the future, like where they see the big gaps or what we need, what conservation needs to be focusing on, or questions that need to be answered in our final few moments. Thau, do we want to start with you as you were our first speaker?
Sure. So I think this thing that we're talking about just now, the gap between data and decision, figuring out how to tell stories, how to get data into the form that different actors need you. That's a big place, and that's data distillation often. And one of the things that we're looking at WWF is sort of systems-based approaches. This is another place where things are going to be moving. Is conservation is complicated. There's forests, food, energy, and then there are government actors, indigenous communities, corporate actors. They're all playing a part and figuring out how those people interact and how they're using data in different ways and figuring out ways to combine the information and that sort of optimizes how those people are interacting and groups are interacting. I think is going to be a big challenge in the future.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, do you want to comment next?
Well, I guess I'll do the data curator role here, and I'll say that one thing you can be thinking about is, I think a lot of we're pulling in data that we can get for free, right? We're getting a lot of satellite imagery, we're getting remote sensing data sets, weather model data sets, and we appreciate that we can get all that for free and that it's available to us. And often the stuff we're collecting, the camera trap data, the biologging data, we're not sharing with each other. And we may have like very good reasons for doing that, but think about how can you reach out to other people where you could safely use that and maybe magnify, amplify what you're doing. And then what are you gonna do? What's your kind of long-term plan for making sure that your own data that you're collecting aren't lost and that they can be contributed in a secure way? So just like keep that in the back of your head and think about how you could be collaborating. And then our tools should be the ones that, are helping you do that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sarah. And Dan, do you want to, okay, the 2 questions for you, Dan. Rob wants to know why it's so hard classifying images. And also, do you want to comment on the big gaps that you see and the big areas we need to be concentrating on?
Sure. The short version of why those 2 particular image types are hard. So the species classification, at least from handheld images, at least the way we're casting the problem, if you want to classify, there is no single human being on Earth who could look at a photo of any species and know exactly what it is. Within any particular ecological domain, there are experts who can say it's that butterfly or this butterfly, but these are really fine-grained problems, and so that's a real challenge for machine learning. The camera trap stuff, everyone who works with camera trap images know they're hard because camera trap images are terrible. They're blurry and they're out of focus, and the animals you get a corner of an animal's tail off in the corner of the image. So just from a computer vision perspective, those are just really, really challenging images in terms of image quality and framing. As far as challenges moving forward, I basically want to double down on what Sarah said on the important role of data curation, in particular in So as much as we have lots of great demos and working systems, there are a lot of machine learning problems still to solve here. And I want to be very cautious. You know, I should demos and try to get everyone excited. We should be very cautious about assuming that things just work. Things don't just work yet on any of these vision or machine learning domains. There's a lot of work left to do. And in order to get the machine learning and computer science community excited and involved in a way that's really making progress, the number one thing we can do is make well-curated data publicly available to them. It's going to be really hard to get the machine learning community to spend time doing what is a lot of the really challenging work about getting data in a state where machine learning people can start working with it. And that is super important work. It's a big part of what Sarah does. It's a big part of what I'm trying to do with the Lila.science website. It's a big part of what Wildlife Insights is doing, and making that data, getting it to a place where computer scientists can download and work with it is a really important way to move the field forward. I'll say things like competitions also. I know they sound sometimes a little superficial. They really make a difference in engaging computer scientists and moving the field along and getting new techniques developed. And a lot of work goes into getting data ready for competitions. So I think we need to continue to place emphasis on not only sharing data from a permissions perspective, but sharing data from a can somebody else really consume this data perspective.
Mm-hmm. That was one of the biggest things I took away from hearing you speak at the recent machine learning workshop at ZSL. It was and the discussions around Kaggle and how much of an impact that had on pushing people forward. So very good points. I'd just like to wrap up and say thank you to our three speakers. And this was fascinating, and I had a really great time, and I learned a lot. And we've had amazing retention for people hanging around this whole time. So thank you everyone else for joining us. We'll pick this up on Wild Labs and follow up with our notes, and we'll have some actually specific discussions to continue these conversations forward next year. And I think there'll definitely be an action point around office hours. I think that's a great idea. And before we go, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Talia Speaker, who works with me at Wild Labs. She's been doing such an amazing job driving this forward. So I just wanted to say thank you to her for all her hard work on this. It's been an amazing series this year, and we're very much looking forward to next year's series as well. And I think that's it. We'll have a great Christmas, everyone. Have a great break, and we'll see you next year.
All right, take care.
Everyone.
Everybody.
Thanks a lot.